Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to another Faith-Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, your host. I am a pastor, retired, but kind of doing an interim gig at the moment. And I am a professor. I am a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, and I am a peddler of hope. And I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith-Seeking Understanding University, a completely fabricated institution of higher learning, but where all seekers are invited to ponder profound things free of charge. I am so excited to have the Reverend Professor David Wilkinson here today. David, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, Alan. Nice to be with you again.
All right, well, great. It's great to have you. So you are currently a professor in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University, which is both of our alma maters. And you were the principal at St. John's College, and you are still there, but you are now the director of equipping Christian leadership in an age of science. Could you, which is abbreviated ECLAS. So could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd be delighted to, Alan. So we've been working for the past 10 years on this project, and it stemmed out of a conviction that particularly when senior leaders, so leaders of strategic churches, bishops or their equivalents across denominations, leaders of or CEOs of parachurch organizations that serve numbers of churches. When folk at that level were often asked about science or confronted science, their reaction was either fear or negativity or complete silence. And we felt that this was a very important thing for the church because it had a ripple down effect through the church. So if you're a pastor with a scientific background and your senior leader wasn't engaging with science, what does that mean for your background that you bring to ministry? If you're a biology teacher in the congregation, a faithful Christian who sees a vocation of teaching science, and your senior leader doesn't affirm or encourage science, what does that mean for your sense of vocation? And of course, if the church is negative about science, then that ripples out into the general culture where we've got this conflict model of science versus religion. And so we began some work 10 years ago on inviting senior Christian leaders to meet scientists. We didn't want to teach them everything about science. We wanted them to meet scientists, whether they be people of faith or not, to get a sense of what science was all about, its joy and its pain, its sense of vocation in serving others, of exploring the world, but also just the very human nature of science. And we've done research around what Christian leaders think about science. We've sponsored a number of local churches to do projects on science. We've worked with about half of the seminaries, theological college and courses here in the UK to help them embed science within the theological curriculum. And we've had a number of staff members working directly and inside the Church of England, which, as you know, Alan, in the UK setting, has a particular voice within political and general culture to help the Church of England say good and sensible things about God's gift of science. And I've been doing it part-time alongside being principal. And now we've moved to working with some international partners in this new phase, not to export what we've learned in the UK, almost exactly the opposite, because we became convinced that context matters when we talk about science and theology. And so we have partners in Singapore and Bangalore and Poland and Kenya. And together, we're doing research and pilot projects to find out how geographical, national, theological context affects how people hear science and how they're related to theology.
Wow. Well, that is just, gosh, that is a great initiative. I wish there was more of that over here on my side of the pond too, as well. So, but that's great that you're doing that. I think that's important. And you probably have a website.
We do. It's called eclassproject.org.
Okay.
and you can find all of the activities there. And we can probably share that website. Yes, indeed.
Yes, I will put that in the description when it's published. So that's great. Thank you for that. Very important work that's going on. And in connection with that, today we're going to talk about kind of scientist. Now, I need to mention you have 2 PhDs, one in systematic theology and one in astrophysics. So you are certainly qualified to have conversation on this topic. And that is, can a scientist believe in the resurrection of Jesus? And this, you discuss these issues in your book, Christian Eschatology and the Physical Universe, which is a great read. So we get to we're Easter season, and as I mentioned to you before we went on, every year I post something on social media. I've got a fairly big following on social media, not huge, but fairly large. And I always post something on the resurrection in one form or another, and talk about the necessity of the physicality of the resurrection.
Yes.
That whatever happened in the resurrection of Jesus, there's something has to be physical about it. It can't just be a metaphor, or it can't be an analogy of something. And I get a lot of pushback, and I will often get pushback from Christians who have a scientific background. I don't know what it is, but they tell me they have one, and just tell me that, once you understand science and the way molecules and atoms work, you can't believe this. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I actually know some people and read some scientists who actually think the physicality of the resurrection is important and that it matters. And in fact, I was looking at the back cover of this book that you wrote. It says that you argue for a rediscovery of the theological theme of new creation and the centrality of bodily resurrection. So you are a scientist who believes that Jesus was bodily raised. So how can you as a scientist believe that?
Well, a number of things, and we'll come on to perhaps nuancing bodily resurrection.
Yes.
But let me affirm absolutely the physicality of the resurrection for me. Now, as a scientist, there are one or two things that I bring to this question from my scientific background. The first, I think, is wanting to sift the evidence, take seriously the evidence, whatever conclusion that may lead me to. And the evidence for bodily resurrection, that the body was not in the tomb on Easter Day, that the disciples had an experience of a bodily resurrected Jesus who ate fish or bread, who was present and could say to Thomas, poke your fingers into the nail holes if you want to. The evidence for that, I think, is very strong. Now, that's not to say that it's proof of bodily resurrection. But our good friend Tom Wright wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called The Resurrection of the Son of God, where as a historian, he went through with great care and balance the whole history around the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And once you do that, you then weigh the evidence. And so, first of all, as a scientist, I come to the evidence of the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances to the disciples, the transformation and growth of the early church, and the little odd things about the resurrection accounts, such as the first witnesses were women at the tomb. If they'd been made up, you would have created stories with men. Those arguments, which have been around for a long time within the Christian church, but I still think ask us to make a weighing of the evidence for or against the bodily resurrection of Jesus. That's the first thing. As a scientist, I'm concerned about the evidence. The second thing is, as a scientist, particularly in the areas that I've worked in, Alan, is not to be dominated by common sense. Now, common sense is a very important thing. My wife reminds me of it a number of times. But the mechanistic universe of Isaac Newton, which was picturable and predictable, is not a very good model for the universe as we now know it. Because 100 years ago, folk working on atoms and electrons began to see that in quantum theory, the universe is unpicturable and unpredictable. Now, I don't want to build a theology purely on the fuzziness of quantum theory, but I do want to say that quantum theory reminds us that the universe is much more supple and subtle than the mechanistic universe of Isaac Newton. And if you asked me, do I understand fully quantum theory, then I'd have to say to you, no, I don't, along with the vast majority of my fellow physicists. We understand how it works in terms of the mathematics, but some of the philosophical questions of quantum theory, things such as the measurement problem, we still don't fully understand. And often within science, you are driven to a conclusion on the basis of evidence, even if your current scientific worldview does not allow you to describe it fully. And so when we come to the resurrection, we may not be able to ask the question, well, explain the bodily resurrection of Jesus through science. But that doesn't rule it out for a scientist. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, I think, the importance of this question for a scientist. I spent most of my life looking at the stuff of the universe, Alan. Stars, galaxies, atoms, electrons, protons. The stuff of the universe is the stuff of physics. It's about the material, physical world. And a God who's not interested in the physicality of the world, and indeed the physicality of the world to come, is not the God that I see in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
The God who becomes flesh, as John would say, incarnate, human being in the space-time history of the universe. It's not a God who works within the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, in very physical ways, valuing the land, the whole human being. And it's not a God who is a God of bodily resurrection in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, or the God who promises in the world to come not a disembodied heavenly state, but a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. So for those three reasons, the evidence, not being dominated by the tyranny of common sense, and thirdly, the importance of the physical to God, are things for me that give the foundations for belief in bodily resurrection.
Yeah, you talk about the domination of common sense for a minute, and by that I'm pretty sure that you mean that the idea is, well, common sense tells us dead people don't get up.
That's
so right. So therefore, it can't have happened. Now, obviously, common sense tells us to be skeptical of things, right? If my friend is sure she saw Bigfoot wandering around the woods nearby here, she's honest and she's trustworthy, and I have no doubt she saw something, but I can raise questions about whether she actually saw Bigfoot. Nothing wrong with that. The problem is, if I understand you, is that getting it in the way to think, well, you know what? Maybe in the midst of the common sense here that we're trying to employ, there was an exception, and we have evidence to point us, not proofs. You've said this before in your writing that I really appreciated, not proofs, but pointers. That there are pointers that, oh, wait a minute, in this instance, there's something going on here we need to take into account.
Very much so. And I think it opens up a conversation. So I'm not wanting to go back into an apologetic tradition within the church, which uses miracle or resurrection to prove entirely the Christian faith. And you're right in terms of the importance of raising questions. That's why I come to the evidence first and say, this is evidence that we can sit down and we can sift and we can question. The problem of the tyranny of common sense is the way that we rule out possibilities. We say, because of our everyday experience, this cannot happen. And in the history of miracles in general, if you look back to the time of the great Scottish philosopher David Hume and others, the Newtonian mechanistic worldview encouraged the belief that God could not intervene in the world. He didn't poke his fingers into the mechanism of the clock. Therefore, miracles were God breaking his own predetermined laws and order. And God couldn't do that. Now, it's the couldn't that I'm picking up on. And common sense often says, well, because I've not experienced it in my everyday world, these things can't happen. Now, they may or may not happen, but it's the can't that I want to question. And the way that modern physics has often done that for me by saying common sense is a very good help, but it's not an absolute court of appeal. There are things that go beyond our everyday experience, our experience in our own lives, or even received wisdom from people like Isaac Newton and others. But as we learn more about the world, as we're open to the evidence, as we question that evidence, and I think, Alan, you make a very good point, Christians need to offer the evidence of the resurrection as something to be explored, rather than let me win the argument with you with this.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about, and which I think is an important point, is that that we have not done enough sufficiently explored the connection between the resurrection of Jesus and the renewal of creation. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about, what happens to me, right? What will happen to me, my resurrection, all of that, and that matters. But that for the Bible, there is a large picture here. You said it before. One of my big problems among others of the metaphorical explanation of the resurrection, it's metaphor, is that I don't quite understand why a God who would create this universe in its physicality would give us a metaphor to point to some aspect of liberation and salvation, which is completely devoid of this context in which we live. I mean, to me, that is the incoherence of it's just incoherent.
I mean, I'd agree with you on that. And I think part of that is the way that in the past Christian faith has taken into itself some thinking from the Greeks. And you remember the Greek dualism was about a separation between the body, the physical, and the spirit, and that the body in some way was evil, spirit was good, and therefore this dualism was taken into certain expressions of Christian faith. And therefore the view that the world to come or resurrection is either just a metaphor, as you beautifully described, or the resurrection is somehow the spirit of Jesus moving on while his body lies a mouldering in the grave. I think that's a result of a downplaying of the physical, which says the physical is not important to God. In which case, your point, I think, stands very strongly, which is, why did God create the physical in the first place? And do we see the physical as purely evil? Well, actually, the scriptures, the Bible doesn't do that. It sees the physical as creation, gift from God. And so those passages, not just Genesis, but Isaiah, the later part of Isaiah, the Psalms, the ways that in John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1, Jesus is the source of all things, sustains all things. This is an affirmation of the physical. And the connection here is very, very deep. A number of years ago, Oliver O'Donovan, in a book called Resurrection and the Moral Order, talked about how the bodily resurrection was God's affirmation of creation of the physical. And so once you begin to see that connection, you then begin to say, well, the world to come also has a purpose in God's plan. It's very important. It's gift rather than just simply an evil backdrop that we need to be liberated from in some way. And often the kind of folk Christianity, which has picked up some of this Greek dualism, well, C.S. Lewis described it very well, didn't he, in Shadowlands. He said lots of Christians believe that this world is real and physical and colorful and solid, and the world to come is a kind of shadowy, grayish existence where souls we just float around like ghosts. And Lewis said, no, you've got it the wrong way round. It's this world that's the Shadowlands. The world to come is more physical, more colorful, more solid. And I think it's that difference between the less than or the more than. Coming back to nuancing bodily resurrection. We're not saying, are we, that bodily resurrection is simply a resuscitation of Jesus. This isn't Lazarus coming out of the grave. And the problem with Lazarus, I feel very sorry for Lazarus, don't you? Because he has to die again, the poor man.
Yeah.
The resurrection is the transformation of the body of Jesus into a resurrection body, which is a more than transformation rather than a less than transformation, which is this kind of grayish soul coming out of our body. And I think if you read the biblical accounts, particularly the gospel accounts of the resurrection, they're struggling with how to describe this resurrected Jesus in this sense of more than rather than less than.
Yeah, it's real interesting you say that with the resurrection stories, because my doctor, Father Jimmy Dunn, many years ago, talks about the episodic character of the resurrection narratives that, we're reading Mark, long ending accepted here, short ending.
Yeah.
But you get a narrative. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are telling, and it reads like a narrative. And all of a sudden you get to the resurrection and it's like episodes. It's they were here walking on Emmaus, or, Mary Magdalene went to, and there is a very different character in the telling of the story, isn't it?
Yes.
As if somehow you're right, that they're grasping to try to explain what has happened. And they're just explaining it. And in fact, it's interesting that there just isn't even a story where and the writer comes in and says, well, this was to fulfill the scriptures. There's none of that, right?
That's right. This is something quite new. I think you're absolutely right. There's something, and I like the episodic nature of it, because they're trying to deal, and this leads us on to, I think, a really interesting point. They're trying to deal with a Jesus, resurrected Jesus, who is in space and time, but no longer constrained by space and time. This is the Jesus who appears in rooms with locked doors.
Yeah.
This is the Jesus who seems to be appearing in different places almost at the same time, yet geographically apart. Now, part of this, I think, is the kind of eyewitness type of bringing together of these stories. But I think part of it is this commitment, or this struggling with, here is the same Jesus, but different. And whether he's in the garden or in this lovely story which you referred to, of him walking all the way to Emmaus with two disciples, and they don't recognize him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've heard a lot of preachers preach about this over the years, and I've heard the most extraordinary kind of sermons which go, well, if you plot the sun where it was in the, between Jerusalem and Emmaus, and they were walking into the sun and they didn't have sunglasses, or that they were crying all of the way that they walked with him, so that's not what Luke's saying. Luke's saying that there was something different about Jesus. It was only when he took the bread and he broke it, very physical act in breaking of the bread, that they realized who he was. There's something here about a Jesus who is transformed, not just simply restored to where he was. And I think it's fair for a number of our fellow Christians to say, sometimes when they hear bodily resurrection, they hear resuscitation. That's never been the doctrine of bodily resurrection. It is about a transformation of the body of Jesus, which, as Paul will say in 1 Corinthians, is the first fruits, or the picture of that which is to come, which gives us a sense of what new creation is all about.
Yeah, it is certainly more than resuscitation, and I think you're right. I think we get tripped up on that. One quick thought, and for you to respond to, is you mentioned Lazarus, who was resuscitated. One of the things that I have pondered is, Lazarus is in the tomb 3 days, and in fact, it's noted that the decay process obviously has started. So there's almost a glimpse of the reversal of decay in this, isn't it? It's not just
there is. There is. That's a very interesting point to ponder. Tony Thistleton, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, talks about how whether our experience of decay being coupled with time in this universe, second law of thermodynamics, that we know that the world is decaying, its disorder is increasing. He wonders about whether Paul's imagery might lend itself to the conclusion that in new creation, the temporal process is coupled to flourishing rather than decay. Now, that's really interesting. It is pure speculation, I think, but it's interesting speculation. That actually that which we experience as locked in this space-time could be different in a transformed new creation. So that new creation doesn't need to be atemporal, by which I mean no time in it at all, no physicality in it at all. It could be a different experience of time and physicality. Not less than, but more than.
More than, yeah. So to what end? I mean, Jesus is raised from the dead, and if this is much bigger, then I get to go to heaven when I die, or whatever that is. You and I get to participate in this renewal of creation, which is good news. But to what end? Jesus is raised from the dead. God raises Jesus from the dead. To what end? What's the big picture here?
What a good question. And I mean, I think we'd need quite a lot of podcasts to deal with that.
Yeah.
I think there are a number of things going on. The first is that this is a sign, a piece of evidence of God's intervention within the physical world. And I use that term knowing all of the times it's been resisted, any sense of an interventionist God. And I understand some of the problems of that, of if you have a God who intervenes, then why doesn't God intervene more? The problem of evil, sometimes we've called it. But this, I think, is a sign which points to God's ability to work within the physical creation. That in itself, I think, is significant for Christian theology. I think, secondly, this is an embodiment of the bigger picture, which is that transformed creation, that God the Creator hasn't lost faith in this creation, and that he's not going to throw it away and start all over again, as if to say, well, you've had your chance and you messed it up. Let's just destroy everything and start the whole thing again. The Creator is a Creator who's committed to this creation, not just to sustain it or to bring us back to the Garden of Eden, but actually to transform this creation into a heavenly city, a new Jerusalem. So it's interesting that the image of Christian salvation is not to restore everyone back into the garden. It's transformation into the beautiful city. So there's something there about God's continued working, which leads to something which is beyond this creation and yet related to it. And that, I think, is very exciting in terms of what the ethical impact of that is for us day by day. Why are we concerned about the environment as Christians? Well, part of it is we believe that creation is gift, it's good. But here's another dimension, which is the eschatological dimension, which says, if God is committed to transforming this creation, then we as Christians should be part of that. Indeed, we should have some confidence in environmental commitment because God's committed to this whole physical universe to transform it and will be victorious at the end of the day, because we see that in the resurrection. So that gives us confidence that when, particularly at the moment, we get frustrated and impatient about governments and certain industries and our own individual lives taking seriously the environment, this is an energy, a motive for us as Christians to say we need to be committed to this. So the Christian ethics finds itself looking both to the past and to the future. We form our judgments around God's purposes in the past and God's purposes for the future, often within lots of Christian theology, certainly within theology and science. We focus completely on the origin of things. Here, the resurrection reminds us to look forward to the conclusion of the story, the transformation of this universe, and begin to do our theology and our ethics between creation and new creation.
As I recall, you had mentioned Oliver O'Donovan's book, Resurrection and Moral Order, which I read years and years ago. As I recall, his first sentence in reference to the issue of ethics is Christian ethics depends upon the resurrection of Christ from the dead. I'm not so sure that so often we treat it that way as people who delve into ethics, but it's very important. So obviously, then Revelation and John is talking about a new heaven and a new earth. That's not a completely new heaven and new earth, right? Absent of
that's right.
This is all gone.
That's right. I think it's interesting. I saw all things new as the revelation of John puts it. That is a word about not newness in a moment of time, but a qualitative difference.
Okay, qualitative, good.
This is, we were having dinner the other night and with a couple we know, and the man had lost a lot of weight. Something that my wife reminds me of at times. And his wife said, it's like having a new man. Now, that didn't mean that she'd taken him down to the supermarket and traded him in for a new model.
Right.
This was a qualitative newness to what's going on. And so a new heaven and a new earth is a qualitative difference. Now, some of this is intriguing. In that chapter in Revelation, it's interesting that we don't go up, but God comes down. That's counter much Christian folklore and teaching. Right. You've got these little phrases like, and there was no longer any sea. Now that, for those who are into sailing and surfing and things of that sort, that may not be good news, but the writer is using the image of the sea as all of that which opposes God, the chaos, that's no longer there. And then there's no more weeping or suffering or death. These are glimpses into a transformed creation, a creation that we still recognize. It's not something completely outside of our experience, and yet something that's new in terms of qualitative difference. And at the heart of that is God himself doing the transforming business. So that one of the things that I think, to come back to your question, which I'm still thinking about, what's the big picture out of this? The resurrection is a reminder, particularly those of us within science, that ultimately science is not the savior. Science and technology will not lead us to utopia in a way that was believed at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Once we have science and technology, all our problems will be solved. Now, don't get me wrong, Alan, science has been wonderful.
Yeah.
It's delivered vaccines, it's delivered healthcare, it's delivered the marvels of transport. One could go way after another. It's delivered the James Webb Telescope with its beautiful pictures of the universe. But ultimately, there are those who trust in science as savior. I think the resurrection for me says, that the hope that Christians have is not in our technological development. Our hope is in the Lord of heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And so this is about where hope is found.
Great. Wonderful. You mentioned the James Webb Telescope, which I have to tell you, the pictures we're getting
Wonderful.
just absolutely floor me, and it just puts me in such awe. Knowing that when we see that and we see the little slice and with however many millions of galaxies are there, it's just a little slice of the entire universe. This universe we know is vast, huge, larger than any of us can comprehend. Why would God raise up a Jewish man in the first century from the dead on a little planet in a section of a galaxy in a corner of a universe, and yet have some kind of implication for the renewal of all creation, right?
Yes. To which you won't be surprised, or maybe if I say I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the questions that Christians rightly are asked and don't have an easy answer to, which is the question of particularity is related to universality. Why God works in particular ways which have universal significance. And the birth of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, this story of God's dealing with particular peoples at a particular time of history in a particular part of the world. Why does God work in particular in order to achieve universal? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I have to say, though, I'm excited by that model.
Yeah.
Because it does give me some encouragement that the God that I follow is able to use the particular to achieve far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
And so I'm not worried about it as a scientist. There are particular things in science that I study that have universal consequences, not least the Big Bang itself, which is an interesting particular universal construct. But I am encouraged, even if I don't fully understand it, that the God that I see in Jesus uses the particular to bring about the universal.
Yeah. I think of Psalm 8, right, where the psalmist looks at the universe, who did not understand what you and I understand, but nevertheless says, I look at the universe and I wonder what are human beings that you are mindful of us, even care about us. But by the way, it's also clear that you're here and working. So there is a God who is universal and also particular, which means something personal.
That's right. It's personal, and that's a really interesting psalm, isn't it, for a whole number of things. I might just question your sense of, did the psalmist know anything of what we know about the universe? I agree with you at one level, but of course the psalmist's experience of the sky was so much richer than our experience.
Yes.
Because of this dreaded street lighting everywhere.
Yes, good point.
And so that sense of the vastness of the universe, not quite James Webb, but that sense of being able to look up at the sky and see, if you've ever been away from street lighting, that immediacy of the universe. I like your point here about the personal, because at the heart of Christian faith is not a God who's simply the God who creates heaven and earth. This is a God who takes initiative in particular human lives. And I suppose the thing about why I find the particular universal thing helpful is that sense of the personal nature of God, that the gift of relationship with folk like you and me and many others, that God has a love bias. God has a love action, which is about forming relationship with particular people, and not just the theologians or the prophets or the priests,
Yeah.
with normal folk like you and me. I mean, it's just wonderful in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I remember as you were talking about the psalmist that, gosh, it's got to be 40 years now. I was in Haiti one time, and I was in one of those spots where there was no light pollution. It was so dark I couldn't even see my feet on the ground,
Yes,
and the
yes,
sky was
yes.
just absolutely unbelievable at night. And so you get a sense of the vastness of it, even though you don't have the web
You do,
telescope.
and
Yeah.
that's right. I mean, I think the other thing that you said that I'd like to pick up on, which I find intriguing, and at the heart of that psalm, the question, what are human beings?
Yeah.
And I think some of the questions that we'll have in the next decade, particularly in science and faith, will be about the nature of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
You touched on one of them, and that is, if in this vast universe we find or don't find other life, the question then, what makes us special as human beings?
Yeah.
The growth of artificial intelligence. And will there become a point where my laptop becomes self-conscious? What are human beings in the growth of such things?
Yeah.
And what about, as we discover more of the human genome, and I share, what is it, about 67% of my genome with cauliflower, which you can probably tell by looking at me, then what makes us special as human beings?
Yeah.
Now, the answer that the psalmist gives is that we're special not because of where we are in the universe or because of our level of intelligence. We're special because God has reached out to us. God has formed relationship. God has given us responsibility. It's a gift of grace
Yeah.
that makes us special as human beings,
Yeah.
not anything in ourselves. But I
Yeah.
think that's a
Wow.
crucial question for the next 10 years.
Yeah, and the affirmation that by God becoming flesh already has deemed us to be
Yes,
special, because
yes,
God had
yes,
become one of
absolutely.
us, which is quite mind-blowing. So, one last question. We have to wrap up. Thank you for your time here. One last question. Where would you, as you continue to work with these issues and think through them, what more further work do you think needs to be done in the area of science and theology?
I think there's many different areas, and
Okay.
one of the great things at the moment is I think across the world we're beginning to see people take science more seriously. So I think there's a question of culture within the church, and that's to move science seen as threat to science being seen as gift.
Mm.
I think that's a big question for the church to engage with. And in terms of subverting the conflict model, which has reigned supreme in culture for many decades, I think the church shouldn't simply be criticizing new atheism. It should be engaging itself in its theology of science. I think that's the first area. I think then within academic theology, this sense of science-engaged theology or theology-engaged science, where we bring together scientists and theologians to talk together about specific issues, whether it be whether there are aliens, the end of the universe, bodily resurrection,
Mhm.
the nature of what it means to be human, artificial intelligence. That for me is science-engaged theology. And I think that comes as you start with the particular issue within science and engage it with a particular faith tradition. I think science and religion, well, both science and religion are not monoliths.
Mm-hmm.
They have great texture to them. And so can we do more of the particular work? I think the third area is something about the valuing of vocation, particularly for those engaged in science. I think we've seen science and technology in very utilitarian ways. That is what they do for us. Governments will invest in science because it will help us in terms of our gross national product.
Yeah.
But actually the vocation to be a scientist on the Webb telescope, to explore the universe, the vocation to be a biology teacher, the vocation to be an engineer. We've sometimes talked about that in terms of medicine, and rightly so. But what does it mean to value the scientist or the technologist, both in church and within society? And then I think perhaps, and you mentioned it earlier, the theological academy engaging with some of these questions and taking science as part of the rich tapestry of theological resource that we can use to think and speak about God. Now that's, I think, happening. I think it's happening in lots of different ways, but I still think there's a bit of a resistance in the academy to engaging in these areas.
Yeah.
So those would be the 4 areas for me.
Okay. Well, that's great. And I just, I really do believe this is such important work, and appreciate that you're doing it. I have found it to be extremely helpful and thought-provoking, and you and others who have engaged it. So I thank you for that and helping us to think about faith and science together. It's a good thing. If indeed this is all God's world, then it's all for us to reflect on and think about. So I appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much again. I would love to have you back for the future in conversation on something.
That'd be great. Thank you for the work that you do in raising these questions.
Thank you.
Helpful.
I appreciate that. Are you working on anything right now? Are you working on a book or anything?
I am on 1 or 2 things. So a number of us out of E-class are working on a book on the conflict narrative, the way that it permeates Western culture, and not just within science and theology, but the way that it's affected popular science and communication. So that's one thing. Then there's a little thing that I'm doing, which came out of the Didsbury lectures, which I gave last year, on how does God work in the world, the problem of providence, as we talk about it. And so those are the current writing projects.
Okay.
But this lovely new role I have at the moment is wonderful, because it gives me a bit more space for writing and
that's great.
Talking to people like you.
Thank you. Well, that's great. I look forward to that book on providence. That sounds interesting to me. All right. Well, thank you for this, David. Friends, thank you for joining us. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Alan Bevere. And the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding University is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand." So friends, keep seeking.